The Nurse Who Fell Through Fire. Reba Whittle's courage in the skies of World War II. A sky filled with fire. The plane shook violently as explosions burst outside the windows. Metal screamed. Smoke rushed into the cabin. Somewhere behind her, a man cried out in pain. Second Lieutenant Reba Whittle had flown dangerous missions before. By September 1944, the young Army flight nurse had already crossed war-torn Europe dozens of times. She had watched wounded soldiers drift in and out of consciousness in the cold belly of military aircraft. She had steadied bleeding men during violent turbulence. She had whispered calm words to terrified boys barely old enough to shave. But this flight was different. This time, the war had found her. The women who flew into battle. Most people imagine wartime nurses working safely behind the front lines. Flight nurses lived inside the war itself. Inside military evacuation planes, there was little comfort and almost no space. The aircraft were noisy, freezing cold, and smelled of oil, sweat, blood, and medicine. Stretchers were stacked in narrow rows along the metal walls. During rough flights, the wounded groaned in pain. As the aircraft shook violently through clouds and enemy fire, the nurses worked without modern medical equipment. No monitors, no intensive care machines, sometimes not even a doctor. Instead, they carried simple but life-saving tools. Plasma bottles swung from hooks in the vibrating aircraft to treat soldiers in shock. Morphine syrettes, small collapsible tubes filled with pain medicine, were used to calm men suffering unbearable wounds. At high altitude, the nurses wore heavy sheepskin-lined bunnel flight suits to protect themselves from the bitter cold inside the unheated C-47s. The nurses themselves became the emergency room. Reba had trained for exactly this kind of pressure. At the Army Air Force's School of Air Evacuation in Kentucky, nurses crawled beneath live machine gun fire, crossed obstacle courses, and learned how to stabilize wounded men during combat flights. The Army wanted these women to become self-sufficient in the air, and they had to be. A flight nurse might suddenly face severe bleeding, shock, burns, or panic attacks, while thousands of feet above enemy territory. There was no pulling over, no emergency room nearby, only the roar of engines and the race against death. By early 1944, Reba had arrived in England. With the 813th Medical Aeromedical Evacuation Transportation Squadron attached to the 9th Air Force, which handled tactical airlift operations in the European theater. For the next 9 months, she lived on Royal Air Force bases across England and flew mission after mission over Europe. 40 missions, more than 500 hours in the air. She knew exactly what waited for her after each landing in France or Belgium. Rows of wounded soldiers, young Americans with shattered legs, burned faces, broken ribs, men doped with morphine staring blankly at the ceiling. Because the pain had become too large for words. And then came the long return flights. Reba and the medical technicians moved constantly through the narrow fuselage, checking pulses, adjusting blankets, stopping bleeding, calming frightened patients, and trying to keep dying men alive long enough to reach England. The nurses rarely talked openly about fear, but they understood the danger. By the end of World War II, more than 200 American nurses would die during the conflict. Still, Reba kept flying. The flight of September 27, 1944. On the morning of September 27, 1944, Reba boarded a C-47 Skytrain named Mary. The aircraft carried medical supplies to a U.S. field hospital in France. On the return trip, the plane would transport wounded American soldiers back to England. Reba knew that once the injured men boarded, she would have her hands full caring for a plane load of wounded men, many in agony. At first, the mission seemed routine. Strapped into her seat inside the loud, unheated aircraft, Reba closed her eyes during the 2-hour flight and drifted toward sleep beneath the steady drone of the engines. She had no idea the aircraft had drifted badly off course. Far below them lay Aachen, Germany, protected by deadly batteries of German 88mm anti-aircraft guns. And because the aircraft lacked Red Cross markings, German gunners saw it as an ordinary military transport. Then the sky exploded. the left engine blazing away. The deafening blast shattered the silence instantly. German flak burst around the aircraft, ripping through its thin aluminum skin. In her diary, Reba later wrote, "Was sleeping quite soundly until suddenly awakened by terrific sounds of guns and cracklings of the plane, as if it had gone into bits. Shrapnel tore through the cabin. Across from her, surgical technician Jonathan Hill was bleeding badly from his leg. Then Reba saw the engine. Flames. The left engine was on fire." She later wrote, "To see the left engine blazing away is simply more than I can express." For a moment, terror overwhelmed her. She screamed and cried. Then something remarkable happened. The wounded surgical technician, the man bleeding beside her, began comforting her. He told her panic would not help anyone. In that instant, Reba regained control of herself. The aircraft lurched violently downward. The pilots fought desperately to keep it in the air long enough to avoid exploding before impact. Inside the plane, smoke swirled through the fuselage as metal fragments punched holes large enough to crawl through. Then came the crash. Reba was thrown forward headfirst into the navigator's compartment. The aircraft slammed into a turnip field outside Aachen. The wrecked plane was burning. One crewman never made it out alive. The others crawled through the wreckage as flames spread behind them. German soldiers quickly surrounded the aircraft with weapons drawn. A German soldier wrapped a bandage around Reba's bleeding head. The Americans had survived the crash. Now they were prisoners of war. The woman the Germans never expected. The Germans stared at Reba in disbelief. A captured American woman in uniform was something they had never prepared for. Reba Whittle would become the only American military nurse. Held prisoner by Germany during World War II in the European theater. Again and again, German officers admitted they did not know what to do with her. One doctor looked at her injuries and said, "Too bad having a woman as you are the first one, and no one knows exactly what to do." Part of the confusion came from the Geneva Convention itself. The laws covering prisoners of war had never truly imagined a situation like Reba's. A female military flight nurse captured deep inside a combat zone. German authorities reportedly debated how she should be classified and handled inside the prison system. Was she an officer? A nurse? A non-combatant? A prisoner? Even the Germans seemed uncertain. Reba herself was badly shaken. She suffered a concussion, deep cuts to her forehead, and emotional trauma from the crash. The prisoners were marched from village to village, interrogated, locked in dirty rooms, and transported by truck and train across Germany. At one point, Reba became hysterical, from fear and isolation after being separated from the others. For months, she was officially listed as missing in action. Back home, her family and fellow nurses did not know whether she was alive or dead. But even in captivity, something inside her remained unchanged. She was still a nurse, nursing inside a prison camp. Eventually, Reba arrived at Allied POW hospitals, operated by British medical personnel inside Germany. The doctors asked if she was willing to work. She immediately agreed. Every morning, Reba cared for wounded Allied prisoners, burn victims, amputees, and severely injured soldiers trapped inside enemy territory. The hospital at Meiningen had once been a concert hall before the war. Now it was filled with broken bodies. Imagine those rooms. Hundreds of wounded men, the smell of disinfectant and burned flesh, rows of amputees learning how to survive without arms or legs, and among them walked a young American nurse who herself was a prisoner of war. Reba later remembered one wounded American named Davis from Dallas, who had lost his right arm. She admired how he still tried to make himself useful despite his injury. The prison hospital could also become unbearably quiet at night. In her diary, Reba wrote of fear, loneliness, and moments when she felt close to breaking emotionally. Sometimes she cried simply from exhaustion and uncertainty. Other times, the monotony of captivity felt endless. Yet small acts of kindness helped keep her going. British doctors decorated her room with curtains and framed pictures. Someone found lipstick for her. A South African prisoner gave her perfume. He had carried through years of captivity in Sicily and Italy. In the middle of war, People still searched for small ways to protect each other's humanity, and every morning Reba continued nursing the wounded. The nurse who refused to break. Months later, the International Red Cross finally learned that Germany was holding an American female military nurse prisoner inside the Reich. Negotiations began for her release. In January 1945, after 4 months as a prisoner, Reba finally crossed into Switzerland and later returned home to America. President Franklin Roosevelt welcomed her home with a telegram, praising her steadfastness while a prisoner of war. She received the Purple Heart and the Air Medal for her courage, but the emotional scars remained for the rest of her life. Years later, she still suffered from headaches, dizziness, anxiety, and psychological trauma connected to the crash and imprisonment. Her final battle came after the war. For years, Reba struggled to receive proper recognition and disability compensation from the U.S. government. Despite being shot down over enemy territory and held prisoner by Germany, officials repeatedly resisted acknowledging the full extent of her wartime trauma. Even more painfully, her story slowly faded from public memory. Only decades later was she officially recognized as a prisoner of war. Yet her suffering helped bring greater recognition to military flight nurses and women serving in combat support roles. The experiences of nurses like Reba eventually contributed to stronger protections, recognition, and understanding for women working close to combat zones. Reba Whittle entered the skies of World War II not to destroy life, but to save it. Even after falling through fire into enemy hands, she continued caring for wounded strangers inside a prison camp. That is the kind of courage wars rarely celebrate enough, and that is why her story still matters today.
It's time to study new words in context. 1. Steadied. Definition: helped something become calm, balanced, or stable again. Example: Reba steadied the wounded soldier as the airplane shook violently. 2. Turbulence. Definition: rough and sudden movement in the air during a flight. Example: the passengers became nervous when the plane entered strong turbulence. 3. Syrettes. Definition: small tubes filled with medicine that can be squeezed into the body quickly. Example: the nurse used morphine syrettes to help soldiers in severe pain. 4. Self-sufficient. Definition: able to take care of yourself without needing help from others. Example: flight nurses had to be self-sufficient during dangerous missions. 5. Pulling over. Definition: stopping a vehicle at the side of the road. In the article, it means there was no way to stop the airplane for help. Example: the driver was pulling over to check the engine. 6. Tactical. Definition: connected to careful plans and actions used during war or battle. Example: the army made a tactical decision before the attack. 7. Theater. Definition: a large area where military battles happen during a war. Example: Europe was an important theater during World War II. 8. Fuselage. Definition: the main body of an airplane where people and cargo are carried. Example: smoke filled the fuselage after the explosion. 9. Blazing away. Definition: burning very strongly and brightly. Example: the soldiers saw the engine blazing away in flames. 10. Deafening. Definition: extremely loud. Example: the deafening sound of the explosion frightened everyone. 11. Flak. Definition: exploding gunfire used to attack airplanes during war. Example: heavy flak burst around the aircraft in the dark sky. 12. Cracklings. Definition: sharp breaking or popping sounds. For cracklings, while it can mean popping sounds, in Reba's diary quote, it specifically refers to the sound of the metal ripping or breaking as the aircraft was hit by shrapnel. Example: the cracklings of fire filled the burning building. 13. Go into bits. Definition: break apart into many pieces. Example: the old box seemed ready to go into bits. 14. Lurched. Definition: moved suddenly and roughly in an uncontrolled way. Example: the truck lurched forward on the muddy road. 15. Amputees. Definition: people who have lost an arm or a leg. Example: the hospital cared for many amputees after the battle. 16. Disinfectant. Definition: a liquid or chemical used to kill germs and keep places clean. Example: the nurse cleaned the wound with disinfectant.
Comprehension questions. 1. Who was Reba Whittle? Answer: Reba Whittle was an American flight nurse who served during World War II. 2. What was the main job of a flight nurse during the war? Answer: a flight nurse cared for wounded soldiers inside military airplanes during dangerous missions. 3. Why were flight missions dangerous? Answer: the planes flew through war zones, where enemy guns and attacks could hit them. 4. What kind of conditions did nurses face inside the aircraft? Answer: the aircraft were cold, noisy, crowded, and filled with the smell of oil, blood, sweat, and medicine. 5. What medical tools did flight nurses use during missions? Answer: they used plasma bottles, morphine syringes, bandages, and other simple medical supplies. 6. How many missions in flight hours did Reba complete? Answer: she completed 40 missions and spent more than 500 hours in the air. 7. What happened on September 27, 1944? Answer: Reba's C-47 airplane was attacked by German anti-aircraft fire and crashed near Aachen, Germany. 8. What did Reba see after the aircraft was hit? Answer: she saw the left engine burning in flames. 9. How did Reba react during the attack at first? Answer: she became frightened, screamed, and cried for a moment. 10. Who helped calm Reba during the crisis? Answer: Jonathan Hill, a wounded surgical technician, comforted and encouraged her. 11. Why were German officers confused after capturing Reba? Answer: they had never expected to capture an American female military nurse during the war. 12. What made Reba historically unique? Answer: she became the only American military nurse held prisoner by Germany during World War II in Europe. 13. What did Reba continue doing while she was a prisoner? Answer: she continued working as a nurse and cared for wounded Allied prisoners. 14. What small acts of kindness helped Reba emotionally in captivity? Answer: British doctors decorated her room, someone found lipstick for her, and a South African prisoner gave her perfume. 15. What lasting problems did Reba suffer after the war? Answer: she suffered from headaches, anxiety, emotional trauma, and struggled to receive recognition for her suffering. 16. Why is Reba Whittle's story important today? Answer: her story shows courage, compassion, and the important role of women and nurses during wartime. 17. What is one important lesson readers can learn from Reba's story? Answer: readers can learn that true courage means helping others, even during fear, pain, and danger.